One thing when you're doing project planning, projects can sometimes last, they can last upwards of a year. Sometimes, you plan your fiscal budget for the year and you have these projects that you initially plan out and you have an idea of who should be doing them and you have an idea of what kind of technology you'll have and how much you'll be saving. So I think from a people standpoint, you have to ask yourself, if you're in the middle of a project that is starting to flounder, do you actually have the right people working on it? Do they have the skill sets needed to deal with the problems at hand and the problems in the future? Sometimes you just have to be honest with them and say, I'm going to reassign you to a different project that makes more sense for your skill set.
Welcome to the Information Week Podcast. I'm your host, Senior Editor, Zhao Pierre Ruth. In today's episode, we're talking about restarting, rebooting, and refreshing. When have you had to rethink an IT project and maybe find a way to recover? Sometimes there are goals of a project that might run awry of what is feasible. There could be a plan on the table that might overlook issues that later surface. So when do you potentially have to triage a project or start over from scratch? So to dissect this topic, to look into ways that organizations might have to potentially restart, reboot, or work in the middle of fixing things, we are joined by Jay Miller, who's a CISO and Vice President of IT for Paessler. Jay, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we're also joined by Andrew Missey, CTO and co-founder for Convos. Andrew, so thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks so much, JP.
Okay. All right. Jay, Andrew, so let's talk about looking at projects, particularly IT projects that may have run into some kind of issue. Maybe you fix it along the way, but in those kinds of circumstances, were there ever any kind of early indications that something might be tough to pull off, or was it a matter of surprises that came up as you were working that were not part of the original plan? Where, if each of you could just give examples of, Andrew, let's start with you. Give an example of, here's a project and this is what we started to see and how it started to kind of raise some flags to start thinking about some kind of course correction.
Yeah, absolutely. I can actually point to the early days of Convos as me and my co-founder were building it. We really came into the market of wanting to try and measure public sentiment in regards to politics and what people think about certain candidates in local and national elections. And as we spoke to customers and clients, we realized that people have this connotation with the term public sentiment, and it has this very generic, like everybody's doing it, it's not special feel to it. And that idea really kind of drove us to think about the business differently and what people actually wanted, especially in the context of what we were building. And that's why we actually are currently under a rebrand where we're going from the old name PubSent, which was public sentiment shortened, to Convos, which is more centered around the conversations that people are going to have. And that was, a big reframing of the business. And so that was definitely an interesting pivot that we had to make there.
Gotcha. Jay, on your side, let's talk about like an IT project that you said, hey, okay, this was the plan. Oh, wait, the plan, meets reality. What were the changes? What are the thoughts that came up?
Oh, sure. So prior to my starting here as a CISO at Paessler, I had several security roles and leadership roles in the last maybe 10 odd years or so. And one of the projects I worked on that needed a complete reboot had to do with network protection hardware. And this is a little bit of its time. If you think about it, you could, back then, if you wanted to get network monitoring into your application and say like an IDS, IPS, and you either didn't have the option or you wanted to have it, fully watched. Back then, you would either look into buying these virtual appliances that hooked into your network traffic and monitored and would trigger alerts, or you could buy these big hardware devices, which again is something that was really common at the time. So there was a project we were all working on. I was project manager of it, where we were trying to secure our entire enterprise. And we had production networks that had certain amounts of certain sites where it was all very distributed across the United States. And we also had an internal environment, which was less bandwidth requirements, and at the same time, it wasn't as critical because it didn't have business critical information, and our customers would not have been down had there been a problem. So when we decided to go forward with the project. So we did the initiation, and we were working on actual purchase and procurement of these hardware devices. What happened is during the procurement, we had a significant hiccup when it was revealed that we had scoped the wrong environment and actually were looking at purchasing hardware for the wrong environment. And we had budget concerns, just like any other project. We were looking at the internal. We wanted to secure the production environment first and foremost, but we were for whatever reason, there was miscommunication between their project manager and myself, where they were actually scoped at the devices and gave us costs for the internal environment, right? So that required a complete reboot. We were really lucky because we had a certain allotment of spend, and we got very creative with fixing this project. What we did was we worked with the provider. We said, hey, here's the problem. And they were able to fit in virtual devices, which were not hardware based, which essentially just send the traffic within our budget. It was almost an even exchange. It ended up being budget neutral by the end of it. But I can tell you there were a lot of scared people having to report this news, none more than myself, right? So where we had to report all this news up. Hey, looks like the scoping document, for whatever reason, we used the wrong network map whenever we were working with the provider. But we did end up saving that one, which was great. But complete reboot.
Gotcha. How quickly did that all unfold? Where you between discovering and then making the changes?
I would say from beginning of discovery all the way to execution, where we executed on the new idea, was about a 3-week time frame, 2 to 3 weeks.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So both of you, have you ever been at a particular point where you looked at an IT project and said, okay, we've got to scrap the whole thing? Or if you haven't been in that particular situation, what kind of criteria have you had to say to yourself, okay, if this happens, if we hit this kind of threshold, all right, we can't proceed with this. We got to do a do-over or rethink entirely and not even go in that direction.
Yeah, we actually recently had built a status page, a custom status page application for our services. And that was running on an Amazon EC2 instance, and it was running Next.js. And just earlier this year, or maybe it was late last year, but Next.js had a big remote code execution vulnerability, and people were able to actually run commands on the virtual boxes of the applications that they lived on. And that status application was not patched. And so we ended up having a breach on that one, where you actually had a bot. It was probably an automated bot come in and plant crypto mining malware on that, so that any user that was on there was going to initiate that job, and it would end up mining from that box's resources. In that specific scenario, we couldn't determine whether those keys or all the secrets were compromised in that thing. So that was an instance where we had to scrap that whole box, rotate the keys, and pretty much start from scratch on that project.
Jay, how about you? Have there ever been a situation, in addition to what you were describing, where you actually had to just be like, all right, we got to just do this whole thing over?
So yes, I was part of some time ago, I was part of an asset management project. It was pretty simple scope overall. The company I was working for grew by numerous acquisitions over the years, and we found ourselves with asset sprawl. We were trying to prevent shadow IT, so we're making sure we could find all the assets and make sure they were protected properly. But you have to start by actually knowing where all of those are. And that can, whenever you're working, whenever you have something, several thousand assets, that becomes quite difficult to do. It's surprisingly difficult. So we enlisted the help of a third-party provider in order to begin an asset management process and scan process. And so they deployed their scanner into our networks, and they went ahead and went for it. But it started becoming obvious, I would say in probably about a month and a half time, that the scanner they had used, which was their proprietary scanner, was unreliable. We noticed that we were getting better information ourselves just by looking at our own inventory. And the results they were presenting to us, whenever we were doing initiation, we were all on board, and everything's, we essentially got sold something that we were bedazzled by the sales pitch, sort of. But the results actually were not useful to us whatsoever. They actually told us less than what we already knew, right? So it was just like, well, we'd sunk a lot of money into this. It was several thousand dollars in order to initiate this project. And the end result was, when we were closing in on the end result, it became obvious that the results were quite poor. So before we executed the full contract, we essentially opted to just discontinue the whole project altogether and just do it ourselves. Because during the time we realized that the provider wasn't right, we actually went for a refund. We were so disappointed with the outcome. But at the end, we did eventually do it, but it took probably 6 more months, and we had to we just used third parties and different contractors to finish the job. So that one really went off the rails after about a month and a half.
How difficult was it to go after that refund? To go with it and to be like, hey, listen.
Well, you know how it is with lawsuits. Essentially, no one really wins at lawsuits. So there were certain payouts. It was quite difficult to get some more money back. A lot of it was sunk cost. So usually you can get creative if you have a good provider, but this particular group was did not have the scruples. So we did recover some of it, but it genuinely lost quite a bit of money at the end of the day, unfortunately.
Gotcha. Well, it's funny how the topic of asset sprawl is actually going to be revisited when we get to the scenario section. All right, before we do that, one last question for you, both of you. How crucial is it, from a technology perspective and staff effort, to have everything on board to course correct, and how did that affect the ROI? I mean, you've already kind of given examples with some situations that you've been in, but what is really crucial on the technology side, on your team side, to really have on the table to when you need to make a change, to say, okay, this is what we need to do. What's the strategy? What's the plan that you kind of lay out?
It's a great question. I think it definitely depends on team size, right? So for example, in my situation, I'm really the tech department. So anything in that case, I really need to kind of establish my own processes. And that's really what it comes down to, right? Is the processes that you have in place for critical situations. I think making sure that you have access to all of your systems and making sure that you have the knowledge to make any fixes that you need to make, that's the most important part, because not being able to know exactly where to go if one thing goes sideways is going to be the biggest weakness there. And so just having a good idea of your infrastructure is going to be key in that.
Jay, anything you want to add to that from your
perspective? So I think you have to look at it from a people, process, technology perspective. One thing, when you're doing project planning, projects can sometimes last, they can last upwards of a year. Sometimes, you plan your fiscal budget for the year, and you have these projects that you initially plan out, and you have an idea of who should be doing them, and you have an idea of what kind of technology you have and how much you'll be saving. So I think from a people standpoint, you have to ask yourself, if you're in the middle of a project that is starting to flounder, do you actually have the right people working on it? Right? Do they have the skill sets needed to deal with the problems at hand and the problems in the future? Sometimes you just have to be honest with them and say, I'm going to reassign you to a different project that makes more sense for your skill set. Not an insult. It's just, this is just not a good fit for you. Right. And then the second thing, when you look at, when you're talking about return of investment, you have to, it's really, really important that you're watching the costs as they accrue. And when things start to go sideways, you need to know when there is a set number where you have to make a drastic course correct. You can level it off. You could have, like a level 1 and 2 and 3. So level 1, if you start to reach that, if it looks like it's something that's salvageable in the future, you can take a look and see how you could course correct and get closer to that, and what's your acceptable threshold. But if you hit a point where there's really no turning back, then it may just be best to pull the plug.
Okay, so now it is time for our tabletop exercise. The Ninja Turtles game screen is up, and we are going to get into questionable ideas. Our tabletop exercise, where our panelists will be put through a series of scenarios as interim executives at the fictional company called Questionable Ideas. Our guests were not given these scenarios in advance, but they do speak to today's topic. My guests are not responsible for the presence of gremlins, kobolds, or goblins in these scenarios. That is entirely my fault. And just for background reference, gremlins represent absolute chaos in an organization. They will do things because, well, there's a red button. Why isn't somebody pushing it? Kobolds tend to represent the more stoic, let's keep things the way they were. Don't rock the boat because it worked fine 50 years ago. Let's keep doing that. And the goblins, they like to move fast. They're not necessarily trying to break things, but hey, something looks new. Why don't we try it? So once again, for reference sake, Andrew J., you will have the same kinds of powers and authority that you would expect in your current roles, which includes, making executive decisions, and if need be, calling in law enforcement, which actually happened in the last episode because of things that certain critters got up to in one of the scenarios, including the CFO getting kidnapped, which they're still missing. Okay, Jay, Andrew, are you ready?
Yes,
I am.
Okay. Scenario, here we go with the scenario. Scenario 1. Questionable Ideas must retire its central platform that has reached end of life. The CEO wants an AI-powered cloud-based platform that can handle logistics management at its warehouses and shipping, manages Wi-Fi networks and inputs from customer-facing locations where customers use their own devices to place orders and interact with additional content. The CEO also wants the platform to be a business intelligence resource to help inform future decisions. The Gremlins introduced the Omega Insight platform, which on paper will meet all those needs. But the security team comes to you both in a panic. The Gremlins hid the fact that Omega Insight captures sensitive data from consumers and partner companies alike, hidden under vague terms. Security can lock this down before the company gets sued, but the backbone of Omega Insight was built around these data capture practices. The Gremlins say, there's no problem if no one knows there's a problem. How do you handle this? Do you start over or do you attempt to salvage something from the project?
Jay, you want to kick us off there?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so this, in my advice, this one you start over. And the reason why is if you have a central platform that is built on top of breaking the law to some extent, or to at least like showing a level of of not integrity, going against integrity for your customers, you have a major problem here. So the security people are right in this instance to be quite concerned about the data that it collects. I've had the luxury of working with global companies now where I'm dealing with the different privacy regulations in the European Union. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, even some of the smallest data elements still count as personal information that you are liable to care for, treat for, and have to know exactly where it is stored and exactly how to delete it. So without that sort of background you may have, where you may or may not, where it sounds like people are not being honest about where the data could be, and they are collecting it anyway because speed, or some other factor, you need to have a frank conversation about potentially re-architecting the project.
Yeah, and I would even add there, I think from the CTO side, the development product side, the smartest move, I agree, would just be to limit the blast radius, right? And shut it down, stop more data from being, sent to this third party service, and kind of go back to the drawing board on that, because you don't want to continue to send data over when that's obviously going to be against the privacy policy and in terms of service there.
I mean, once again, the gremlins reiterate, hey, listen, if you don't bring up the issue, no one's going to know. So, the security team and legal department are very pleased with your approach in handling this. Okay, on to scenario 2. Work continues on developing a non-invasive central platform for the company, but the warehousing teams have a problem. The goal of having everything from forklifts to air conditioning connected to the platform have run into compatibility issues. Some of the warehousing equipment is just too old and cannot interface with the platform. It's they're not recognizing each other. The options seem to be to replace the old yet reliable hardware that the teams are familiar with, or scaling back on some of the modernization features that the CEO wanted in this new platform in order to allow for compatibility. The goblins show up with another option. They say replace the old equipment and the personnel. They say everyone should just focus on burning AI tokens anyway, including on the warehouse floor. How do you proceed?
Oof. I would say I think the solution here is a more stage-based rollout, right? It's not an all or nothing, right? You want to slowly introduce the new technology in, and so like you said, the hardware that they're currently using is reliable, so you don't want to just throw that to the curb and spend a whole bunch of money to just upgrade things that don't need that. But at the same time, as you do your rollout, as things start to either break or get older, and you decide, hey, now it's efficient for us to, or it makes sense for us to perform those upgrades, then you can do that and start onboarding those newer devices onto that platform.
Yes. And I think that, first off, Andrew, I think it's a great answer. You don't have to look at it black and white. You have to look at it, and you have different use cases. I think the first thing I would do is perform a risk assessment. So you want to see, when you're looking at old equipment, as reliable as it could be, there could be some significant security holes that you may be facing. The other thing too to think about is, if you're catering your product to an older technology, then you're going, and especially if you're spending money against it, there has to be a point where you have to say, this is just not worth doing, because as much as we want to do this, it may be better to invest in new equipment. The use of AI is interesting, because AI is more than emergent at this point. This is shattering. This is just groundbreaking technology. There needs to be, to Andrew's point, there needs to be a use case, including AI. It's something that should be welcome, and it's something that could get you ahead of the pack in terms of enablement, technical enablement, and digital transformation. So what you want to think about is, what are the risks, what are the rewards, and what is it going to cost to maintain the old, and what are the potential technical security risks that you have with using new and emerging technology?
Well, the goblins were definitely looking forward to running around on AI-powered forklifts. Not that they even know what the AI powering of the forklifts
Right.
would do, but hey, it would be fun for them, at least until they run into somebody. Okay, on to the last scenario. Questionable Ideas is pushing the new platform into every department that they have, but one of the trade-offs to increase adoption was to give staffers full autonomy to choose which tools they want to integrate with the platform for their specific roles. As the platform scales up, the system response time slows down. Redundant tools were introduced by giving staffers so much leeway. If this continues, the new platform is going to drive up costs and be slower than the old one. The kobolds say it is time to take all choice away from staffers. No more bringing your own tools, devices, or AI into the company. Their plan would push the company into a vendor lock-in situation, but it could potentially alleviate headaches on the project. How do you proceed?
So this is an interesting one. I'll take this one.
Yeah.
So obviously the idea of using unified tool sets is I'll start from the beginning, but the idea of using unified tool sets is one that is of the utmost importance. It becomes very difficult to align your work if you're using different tools. one of the problems is now you have to take that away, and you're going to have small pockets of people that are going to be protesting all of this because they're just happier with the tool. And I've dealt with similar situations like this before, actually. So I think what you want to do is you do have to rip the Band-Aid off. You have to see that essentially you've gotten yourself into a reboot situation here, because obviously some poor planning got you into a jam where your new system isn't going to work as well as the old. So you do the reboot, and you put guidelines in where you have a procurement process. You put different guidelines in so that you look at your procurement process and you do the comparisons first. You can have these stakeholders bring the tools that they like to it, but then you get a group, like sort of like a center of excellence together, and you decide what the best tool is for use there. So essentially, you need to put that procurement piece in there, and then as you do that, you start to eliminate the tools that people don't need and do the integrations that need to be done. And then you can start considering locking into vendors. So because you could get major price incentives if you do lock into vendors for a longer time. But you do need that alignment, and you need to make sure that everybody is behind it ultimately. So.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And it's very important too for the collaboration aspect as well, being able to use the same tools. And a lot of those tools do have built-in collaboration aspects to them as well. I do think it's reasonable to maybe implement a process where you're able to, request a tool for a specific team, right? If like the design team wants to use Figma or something else aside from Figma, or however that may be. But I do think, and to your point too, vendor lock-in, they do give some really great discounts when you buy in bulk and buy bulk licensing and all that good stuff. So that's something to consider as well from a cost-saving perspective.
Well, the Cobalts are pleased with your decisions, and they're ready to take hammers to any machine that does not meet the approved list and smash everything and chuck it out the window immediately. Okay, Jay, Andrew, both of you have been fantastic. Thank you so much for coming out to the podcast today, sharing your insights and toughing it out with the questionable ideas questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, JP.